figure out how this works? Yes, that's fine. Thank you, Teresa, for this wonderful introduction. And let me start to thank Teresa Jiménez-Barbat for the kind opportunity to make a contribution to this meeting under the title Towards a Secular Europe Confronting Fundamentalisms. It's a great honor to be here together with Mariam Namazi. The aim of my talk is to make a contribution to the building of a European identity by invoking a forgotten dimension of one of the most important European human rights. And this sentence is literally copied from the program of Euromind, which I support. But before I start, let me first say something about my background. I'm an academic. I teach jurisprudence at the University of Leiden, so I'm responsible for the education for a new generation of legal scholars every year, thousands every year. We have a lot of students. But I'm not in the front line of the struggle that we're talking about today, and which was also introduced in the talk by Ms. Barbat. There are many people who lost their lives in this struggle, in a certain sense, like my countryman Theo van Gogh in 2004, 10 years ago. People who have lost their families, many people present here, actually. And that's not my background. I'm not an ex-Muslim. I'm not not even an ex-believer. I was an unbeliever all the time. I come from a secular background, so my personal, in a certain sense, my personal commitment to this theme may be called a psychological riddle. I have nothing to do with it, apart from the fact that I think that it's a very important topic. It's a very important topic for Europe. It's a very important topic for jurisprudence. And it's something that we have to deal with somehow. But it's very complicated, and what I hope to show now that there are some problems on the way. Well, as I said, the human right I want to focus on is the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And with the forgotten dimension, I want to highlight that this right includes the freedom to change your religion or belief. By the way, this is not a matter of personal opinion. So it's not Paul Cliteur who is saying, yeah, well, let's the freedom of religion. Let's include also the freedom to change your religion. No, that's official European policy, and in a certain sense, it's official world policy because it's included in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and there it comes. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, and then it goes on, but I stress or highlight the freedom to change your religion or belief. And that freedom to change your religion or belief is also to be found in other human rights declarations. For instance, in Article 9, and there comes the European dimension, in Article 9 of the European Human Rights Charter, we read, I quote, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and this right includes the freedom to change his religion or belief. But this freedom to change your religion for another religion, and the freedom to change your religion for no religion at all, so basically becoming an apostate or an atheist, is in jeopardy nowadays, in grave jeopardy even. And the most brutal illustration of this jeopardy was given this weekend, actually, when the British newspaper The Independent brought the news that the Iranian state media have renewed the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, a book published in 1988. 40 state-run Iranian media outlets have jointly offered a new 600,000 bounty for the death of Salman Rushdie. And Rushdie is only the most well-known author who got into great trouble with the strict fundamentalist interpretation of Islam by Iranian authorities. The problem is that what is in human rights language called the freedom to change your religion, with a basis in the Universal Declarations of Human Rights and also in the European Convention, that freedom to change your religion is for religious terrorists anathema. They call this apostasy, atheism, heresy, and these are to be punished with no less than capital punishment. And if the state fails to apply this sentence, capital punishment, the religious terrorists contend that the individual has to step in, and that it's basically the legitimacy of what you can call the religious terrorist. And this is precisely what we see happening nowadays. Religious fundamentalism presents itself in an extremely violent form. We have seen that in Paris on January 7, 2015, when in an attack on the editorial offices of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, 12 people were brutally murdered. But we have seen it also in many other situations. Now, modern religious terrorism, or what I would like to call theo-terrorism, theo God, and terrorism based on a conception of God, theo-terrorism, is most effectively applied now in its Islamist branch, but basically you can also see it in other world religions. In 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by Yigal Amir because he entered into peace negotiations with the Palestinian people. And you have abortion physicians in the United States of America who are killed by Christian theo-terrorists because they work in an abortion clinic. So it's you find it in all three, I think, of the monotheist religions. But we have, but of course, what we see, especially in Europe nowadays, that is the danger of Islamist theo-terrorism. And well, this is so serious that at this moment in time, you can say that in Europe we have to deal with what I would like to call a sort of modern hostage taking. What does that mean, modern hostage taking? Let me try to explain what I mean with this. Well, this process started basically with the death verdict, the fatwa on Rushdie in 1989, and it came in a sense to a peak for the time being with the murder of the cartoonist of Charlie Hebdo on January 7, 2015. So basically beginning 1989 and the provisional end of it 2015. And the problem is this is a whole new development, I think, in the process of hostage taking. The first modern hostage, in a certain sense, is Salman Rushdie, whose book, The Satanic Verses, was brought to the religious dictator Ayatollah Khomeini, who put a place on his head. Now, why is modern hostage taking? Why is it so effective? Why is it so effective? Well, this has something to do with the fact that there is a difference between traditional hostage taking, I think, and modern hostage taking. Traditional hostage taking, for instance, the taking of Terry White, when he traveled to the Middle East, he was taken hostage. And what has to be done then? You have to take care of the hostage, to have to put him you have to hide him from the public, and you need a special team of guards who's guarding the man. But what modern hostage taking in fact introduced, that you do not have to take someone physically hostage, but the only thing you have to do is ask for your secretary and say, well, let's make a fatwa and let's put a price on the head of this person. And what happens then is that the country where the person is living, whether it's France or it's Great Britain or another European country, you cause a lot of trouble, not only for the person in question, but also for the countries where the people are living. And at this moment in time, still this is a very, very effective technique, basically, to silence those critics of radical religion. It's a very, very effective technique also, in the sense that it's a kind of new terrorist strategy. Why it's so effective? Now let me discern a few points. First, it does not, modern hostage taking, it does not require complicated actions to get the person targeted in your power. I already referred to that. If you take someone hostage in the traditional way, then you have to capture the person first and subsequently keep him alive in some hidden place. In other words, you have to spend money and resources on this. Usually they start quarreling with their fellow criminals, the people who take the other people hostage, and that's very complicated. Now, a fatwa of the type of Ayatollah Khomeini issued in 1989 does not have this inconvenience for the kidnappers. The only thing you have to do is make the statement that will cause the havoc in the world. And this shows, according to Daniel Pipes, a writer on radical Islam, that's a very, very, very easy technique. You don't have to organize a spectacular seizure of the victim in a faraway country, like the Israelis have done with Adolf Eichmann. You only have to formulate your fatwa. The second reason why modern hostage-taking is so effective is that this has a great terrorizing effect on the persons targeted. An example, for instance, from the UK may make this clear. Mohammed Sidi Khan, one of the 4 suicide terrorists responsible for the London Underground bombings at July 7, 2005, said, and now I quote, "Until we feel security, you will have our targets, and you will be our targets, and until you stop the bombing, gassing, imprisonment, and torture of my people, we will not stop this fight. We are at war, and I am a soldier. Now you will taste the reality of this situation." End of the quote. Now, I think this is an important passage because it teaches us something about the motives of the theo-terrorists. The aim is apparently to let the people feel uncomfortable in their situation. The idea is to get the message across that although people may feel safe on the territory of their own state, in fact they're not. And that's very effective. The reason why this is the case is this: many people have the idea that for instance, if Terry Waite is captured somewhere in the Middle East, that's far away. But if you succeed in intimidating people, using their human rights in your own country, in Western countries, that's very effective. So it was a very effective technique that Ayatollah Khomeini introduced in 1989. But this particular feeling of unease it's nothing compared to the feeling of unease on your own state. That brings me to a third point why the modern tactic of modern hostage taking is so effective. That's also the case because it's extremely humiliating for the country where it occurs. Usually people concentrate on the immediate victims, people like Rushdie or the Danish cartoonist Kurt Westergaard, or in my country Rudy Karel, who, although that's a very unknown story. But we should not forget that also the British and the Danish people are involved. It's not only a matter of the direct victims, but also the country where the people come from. When in 1979, the American embassy in Tehran was occupied, seizing 66 Americans, this was a humiliating experience for the United States. When in April 1980 a rescue operation was organized and failed by the Carter administration, this added to the catastrophe. But when a government cannot fulfill its primary function, which is maintaining order and peace on its own streets, that's a really humiliating affair for a government. And it has always been my impression that for instance, Margaret Thatcher had a very strange relationship with Salman Rushdie, not primarily because Rushdie was a leftist critic of the right-wing policies of Margaret Thatcher, but because of the Rushdie affair. This is speculation, I have to confess that, but I think there are reasons to think this is the case, that in a certain sense the Rushdie affair made Margaret Thatcher seem weak. Because the British government was simply not able to fulfill its primary function, which is to protect citizens from harm on your own territory. You know the anecdote, perhaps. There's a famous anecdote about Thatcher and President Bush Sr., which is relevant here. When Bush hesitated about how to react to the seizure of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein in 1990, Thatcher helped the American president to overcome his hesitations with the words, "This is no time to go wobbly, George." Well, in the Rushdie affair, in a certain sense, much more delicate, Thatcher and the British government have been wobbly all the time. And I think that's the most important reason why nowhere in the autobiography of Margaret Thatcher we find any mentioning of the Rushdie and of the Rushdie affair. It was simply too embarrassing. Now, the fourth reason why the tactic of modern hostage-taking is also superior to the older tactics is because with the tactic of modern hostage-taking, it proves to be much easier to formulate a confusing, to stimulate, a confusing debate within European countries about the foundations on which those European countries rest. What do I mean by that? One of the riddles, in a certain sense, is that there were so few people who supported people like Rushdie, Kurt Westergaard, and that many people commented on the supposedly insulting nature of their books, their films, their public stances. That's strange, is it not? I mean, after all, we have freedom of thought, we have freedom of expression, including the possibility to change your religion. It's all there in the founding documents. But still, when those founding documents are being practiced, there are a lot of people who adopt a kind of attitude of political correctness and say, well, perhaps perhaps it's a little bit your own fault, and perhaps you could have phrased your criticism of radical Islam, which I support, by the way. You could phrase it a little bit more cautiously. A lot of people say that, including intellectuals, including people who were colleague writers of Rushdie, fellow cartoonists of Kurt Westergaard. The support was not, to formulate it in a euphemistic way, the support was not overwhelming. That's interesting to see. And that brings me to the fifth and the last reason why the modern tactic of hostage-taking is so effective. This is because the victims, the direct victims of this, can never know when the situation has been terminated. Well, in fact, there is no termination. There is no end. I mean, in the beginning of the Rushdie affair, in the first few days, security people say, well, the politicians will figure this out in 1 or 2 or 3 days, and then it will be settled here in the European Parliament, in Great Britain, in cabinet. They will solve this. But we're now decades further, and it still has not been solved. This weekend, a new renewal of the fatwa. So it's still on the agenda, and I have no official declaration yet from David Cameron or Boris Johnson or other British politicians on this renewal of the fatwa, which is worrying in fact, because you can always say it's no news apparently. You never know when the situation has been terminated. There is no termination, no end. There was no end when Khomeini died, for instance. He died a little. There was no end with new declarations of the Iranian government. In fact, there never is an end. The only end is, well, sometimes it's the natural death of the victim, Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands in 2004. And that's a very sad thing to see. Okay, before you get a little bit depressed about my talk, let me talk about some solutions, because there is some light at the end of the tunnel. It's not all well. The fact that we have this conference here is light at the end of the tunnel. Is it not, Teresa? That's I mean, we're here, but one of the most important things that we have to do, that somehow we have to convince society of the of why this is an important problem. What I do in Leiden with my students, I say, well, freedom of religion is not the most important thing. It's the freedom to change religion, which is the real issue. And freedom of thought is not the real thing. It's the freedom to express thoughts which are shocking to other people. That's the reason to have freedom of thought, to say things that people disagree with. So in a certain sense, when we talk about human rights, and also scholars and politicians and everyone involved in this discussion has to make a contribution to the change of the mentality, I think, in talking about human rights. By the way, when I saw the presentation by Teresa only half an hour ago, I think, I saw a picture of one of the Danish cartoons, the cover of Charlie Hebdo. I think it was in 2006 or 2007. There was a conference here, and I wanted to make a contribution by talking about this specific topic. It was not very welcome to talk about the Danish cartoon at that time, but I don't want to be cynic, but perhaps one of the the bright sides, perhaps, of the intensity of the crisis of this moment after the Charlie Hebdo killings is that now it's easier to talk about these things. Although it's still a tricky subject, but now we can talk about these things, and that's an advantage. Because I think, and this is an optimistic note, that in the long run, the terrorists have a very weak cause. I mean, it's perhaps European human rights organizations. They have to come to their senses. They have to reorient themselves in a new world. But once we do it, I think it must be possible to win the battle, basically, for freedom of thought and freedom of expression and freedom of religion. And I think that basically the outline of such a strategy has been outlined in the Euromind program, which is perfectly fine to me. This will mean something also for the restructuring of Europe in the field of state-religion relations, in the sense that I think it will mean that secularism will have the best opportunities to unite people on European territories. When after the Second World War, Europe committed itself to the European Charter of Human Rights, it basically gave a constitutional foundation for religious diversity. And what happens when you give the people the opportunity for religious diversity, that is that people will act according to that possibility. So you will not have people who choose for one particular religion. They will choose for the religion of their own choosing. It's not the tyrant anymore who decides, well, this is the territory for Protestantism, so you all have to be Protestant. This is the territory, the Henry VIII. Now we're going to choose every one of you for Anglicanism, or in Spain now we'll all choose for Catholicism. No, people make free choices, and then you get diversity. And then, of course, the next question is, now, how do you manage this diversity? And I think the only answer is that is for the state to be religiously neutral. Because once the state is seen as a... I have to put a signature here?
Yes.
Okay. I thought you were going to remind me of my time, but that's not the case. No. But once there is the opportunity for making your own choices in the field of religion, people choose different things. And the European project is, in a certain sense, very interesting because you have here now the situation where the state has to manage a real and deep religious diversity. And the only option, I think, that is then break with all state religions. So Great Britain has to disestablish its official Anglican Church, basically, and I think that the French model of the laïcité, or what they call a strict secularism, is the most likely model to survive in this big struggle that we have at this moment about the most likely model. Okay. This is what I have to say. There is some time now for questioning. I would welcome that. But
I think afterwards.
Okay.
The speech of Marianne.
Okay. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you for your attention. Then. Yep.